All right. So, why is my bread flat? Well, there's lots of reasons why. First thing is how you knead the dough. Was it kneaded? Did you get enough tension on the outside? How was it shaped? Not only was it how did you knead it during the first process, but towards the end, how did you shape the dough? How was it molded? How was it pulled? Perhaps the dough is overproof. That's another reason why. Several things. If you overproof it, what happens is I like to make sure that my dough never rises above 50%. 50%, make sure that you don't exhaust all the yeast. The other thing that can make it overproofed is if you put too much yeast in it. So if you think about it, if I put a lot of yeast in the recipe, it's just going to eat the flour too fast. Um, Part of the thing that goes with shaping is this thing that's called surface tension. It's basically, do I put enough? Is there enough gluten and stretch in the dough itself that's going to contain or hold the shape? Finally, another thing is that if your yeast has been overproofed, if it's used up all of its energy, you don't get any oven spring. So these are the things we're going to address. And the last thing that came to me this morning was altitude. What does altitude have to do with cooking your bread? I think that could be another problem. So let's look at your bread today. Here's the New York Times recipe. This is what it called for. It's very vague. I never liked New York Times. I still can't figure out how in the world they can have, 6,000 reviews and still get 5 stars when any other type of bread recipe typically gets maybe 300 reviews. So I've always found that a little biased, so I never liked it. But anyway, moving on, off my soapbox. First thing I want to do is I want to convert this to something that's usable, grams, so I can get some more information on it. 6.5 cups is such a broad number. I like using grams as a measurement because 6.5 cups could range anywhere from 975 to 1,200 grams, depending upon how dense you pack the flour, how loose it is, so forth. Obviously, water doesn't compact, so it stays the same. And the same way with yeast. So you can see there's these, and salt. So these big variations. And at the end of the day, your hydration could be anywhere between 59 and 72%. Okay, and the weight on this New York Times recipe is really heavy. To me, that's too heavy of a bread to make for a single loaf. I know they talk about grapefruit size loafing and stuff like that. And I did a little bit of that, as you'll see in a little bit. So here's what I used on the recipe. Basically, I did a quick conversion, just proportion everything the same, and I went from roughly 1,800 grams down to 900 grams of weight. The other thing I did is I adjusted the amount of water to make sure that I was at 77% hydration. Now, hydration is basically what percentage of flour versus water. So easy math, you see at the bottom, I can calculate exactly how much flour and water I would use, as well as the yeast. So I took the average of it and averaged it out from there. So with that said, though, I personally think that the yeast count is way too high. Regardless of the environment, I think the yeast should probably be more around 7 to 8 grams. And then, salt is obviously a flavory thing and is your own personal preference, but 16 grams seemed a little too much for my liking, so I cut back on that as well. That's not the recipe I made. The recipe I made in the videos is the yellow one, but I was on a run today, and Stuart, and I realized that altitude plays a big role into this. I'm like, wait a second here. Why would his bread be flat at a higher altitude if there's less pressure? And then I realized that what happens is that the yeast grows faster in that altitude. So I did some research, and if you're above 3,000 feet, you should probably cut the yeast by about 25%. So 25% of 11 grams is 8 grams, or if you use my recipe, what's in the parentheses, it would be about 6 grams. So yeah, I would put this yeast, if you look at it, it's almost half of what they're asking for in their recipe. So at least if you use mine. So same way with the salt. The salt stays the same, but the main key here for altitude is reducing the yeast by about 25%. There's other things you do later, like how long do I cook it, but we'll talk about that later. So anyway, all right, timing's everything. Real quick, I'm not going to go through all this, but typically with this bread, if you cook it like at room temperature, it should probably take about 3 hours, 25 minutes, unless you're at altitude, because again, things go faster. The time it takes for it to proof is almost cut quite dramatically, maybe 40-50%. So if you think about this, I did it in the proofing oven in my demos, which ended up being about the same amount of time as if you did it at high altitude on your you know, on your stove or on the kitchen counter. So should take about 2 hours and 30 minutes. Not bad to get a good tasting bread. So that's it. Let's go from there. We'll see what happens. I'm going to show you my video now. All right, super hot, 300 grams of water. Get the last drop in there. And then I'm going to add 300 grams of flour. I'm going to take that and I'm going to mix it together. And this is what I call my autolist. The super hot water is going to help bloom that flour right up. Also, it's going to help with the yeast when you add that in a little later because it's already going to be warm. As you can see, it's barely mixed up. It's just really, really shaggy. That's what you want. Let that sit for about 30 minutes. That's my autolist. Meantime, I'm going to make the yeast and let that bloom up. All right, so I have my scale tared off for the weight of my glass. So you can see I have like right at 91 grams of water. It's hot water, which is what I want. And I'm going to zero that out. And I'm going to add about 28 grams of honey to it. And I'm going to stir that up. And then I'm going to check the temperature. I want to get it down to about 110 degrees. You can see I stirred it up. I'm pushing about 119, 120 degrees. I'm gonna let that sit for a little bit while I measure out my yeast. While I'm waiting for that to cool, I'm gonna go ahead and measure out the salt. Now your recipe, the New York Times recipe actually calls out proportionally it's gonna be 16 grams of salt. So I went way over while I was talking. So we're gonna measure this out to 16 grams. Usually I use about 11 grams in this one, but yours is really salty, but that's what your family likes, so that's what we're gonna go with. So add a little bit back. There you go. I'm gonna just take that and add it right on top of the dough that's autolist. This way I don't forget. I can't tell you how many times I forget to add salt to my recipe. It sucks. All right, I checked the temperature and I think it's right where I want it to be. Is about 110, that's perfect. So I'm gonna go ahead and add my yeast to this. Now, I usually add about 11 grams or 8 grams, but actually I take that back, between 5 to 6 grams. In this case here, the New York Times recipe, again, it's very yeasty, so I modified the recipe based upon the weight of the flour to match that of the New York Times, so it ended up being 11 grams of yeast. So stir it up a little bit, and I'm gonna let this bloom, probably for about 5 minutes. So in the meantime, my autolist has been doing for about 15 minutes as I move and jockey things around. I'm gonna go ahead and measure out the rest of the flour that I need for the recipe now while I wait for that to bloom. All right, so the rest of the recipe, I'm gonna need to add another 208 grams of flour. So I put that in there and I'm just gonna add that into this autolist right here. Just dump it right in. All of it in at once is all you gotta do. One thing I noticed is that it calls for all-purpose flour. I recommend bread flour because it has a higher protein content. Because of that, you're gonna get more structure. You're gonna make sure that that dough can stand up properly. Most all good baking flour will use bread flour as opposed to all-purpose flour. So I recommend this because of that higher protein. All right, you can see, look at how much this bloomed up here. I don't know if you can see the bubbles or not. Pretty cool. That's all foamy. I put everything over into my KitchenAid. I'm just gonna dump it all right in. So now I have all my ingredients in. My yeast is happy and bubbly. And that was no more than 5-6 minutes. Put it in here, lower it down, turn on real low at the beginning, and just let it do its stuff. I will let this go for about 8 minutes. After it gets all incorporated and all the flour is like no longer dusty or dry, I'll scrape the bottom of the bowl. Be sure to scrape the very bottom of it because there will be some dry ingredients on the bottom. So as a matter of fact, looking at this, I think it's pretty darn good to scrape it now. So I'm gonna pause it real quick and scrape the sides of it and get to the bottom. Once I get done with this, then I'm gonna just turn it on for 8 minutes and let it do its thing. And really, I don't care how shaggy it looks or how wet it looks, because trust me, all that will go away when we do the folding process. So, all right, here you go. Turn it on. I will go through halfway through the 8 minutes. I kind of like to pull the dough down off of the dough hook and just kind of redistribute it. I'll do that about halfway through. So that's it. All right, that's been 4 minutes. You can tell this is really soupy, but don't worry about it. It's all good. I'm gonna scrape the sides real quick while my son does a Snapchat of me doing my video. Scrape the sides real quick. You see it's starting to get a little elasticity to it. And if you look in there, it's almost looking like a ball, which is what you want. That's been 4 minutes. I'm gonna give it 4 more minutes. This time I'm gonna turn it on 2 instead of 1. So it'll be a little faster. All right, that's done. I'm gonna go ahead and remove this out of here. Scrape all this off. You can see it's got some good elasticity to it. That was 8 minutes in there. Move this out. Okay, I'm gonna scrape the sides, and what I'm gonna try and do is when I scrape it down, I'm gonna start forming it into a ball so I can pour it out. You see how that's coming together like this? And then what I did is I took my big old sheet here, and you can see I got oil in there. I just use vegetable oil. The reason I use vegetable oil is because it doesn't have any flavor to it. And watch, you see it's almost like pouring it out. I'm just gonna pour that right into this bowl here, like that. A little bit more in there. I want to make sure we get all the bread. There we go. Okay. Now what I want to do is I want to just flip this over. It's super soft. Get my hands a little greasy by maybe using the residual grease in here on both of them. And I'm just gonna flip this over like that. You can see it's super, it has no form. But that's exactly what you want it to look, just like this. Now, I cover it with my fancy dancy shower cap. There you go, and I'm gonna stick this in the oven. I stick it in the oven with the light on. This way it's near a temperature that is proofing, but the lights are hot enough generally, what I notice. And the other thing I bought this stupid little thing. It's a hydrator, like you put at your desk, and it puts out a puff of smoke. So I take that and I stick that in the oven with it, and this way I get humidity. Obviously yeast loves humidity and temperature, so there you go. All right, there it is. I got the oven light on. I got it sitting in there. I'm gonna close the door and let it sit there for 30 minutes and I'll be back. So real quick editor's note, if you're cooking at high altitude, I strongly recommend you do not use the warm proofing oven. As a matter of fact, as we go through this folding process, that very first proofing that I say put in for 30 minutes, I'd recommend you put it in the refrigerator to slow down how quickly the yeast forms. So stick it in the refrigerator for the first 30 minutes, and then the rest of the folding processes, which is step 2 in the videos, just leave it out on your counter. And I think that's gonna be best. And you'll probably reduce the time of proofing from like 30 minutes probably down to about 20 minutes on your counter because of high altitude. So keep that in mind. The video was made for here in St. Louis, so it's gonna be a little different than when you make it at 6,000 feet.